Welcome back, guys. We will now be taking a dive into budgeting systems and looking at the different methods of developing budget estimates, okay? So different perspectives, but we will definitely dive into all of the different types of budgets some way, somehow. So the first method of developing a budget estimate is a zero-based budget. Now, in my career, I have done a zero-based budget, and it's really, really interesting to just kind of start from scratch. It's a fresh perspective. So in this, with zero-based budget, it requires managers to estimate sales and production and other operating data as though they're looking at it from the first time. So they're not looking at it based on last year's information as many budgets does. They're looking at it as if, hey, they've never had an expense before and what can I expect? Okay, so again, it's a fresh perspective. What I would say is it's good in theory. My personal opinion or my professional opinion is it's good in theory, but when you try to apply it to a large organization, it is difficult in the sense that it's just hard to put into practice because people traditionally want to look back at what they have previously always taken into account. And so trying to get the point across of, hey, we want a fresh approach, that idea is kind of lost on some of your manufacturing people or the people that's in the facility, okay? But moving on to a more common approach, you usually have a static budget or flexible budget. And we'll talk more into detail on both of those types of budgets. But what you should know is these are the most common. And the way that we go about it is we use prior year's budget and then we revise from there. And you can see that I have a little asterisk right next to revise because it's going to be based on what we expect to happen in the future. Of course, no one knows it, but that's why it's an estimate, right? We're trying to forecast what we think will happen in the future, given all of the information that we have at this moment, right? So, what's a good point right now would be when they were doing the 2020 budget, I can almost promise you that no organization or most of the organizations didn't see the COVID-19 being such a huge, how it would play or that it would be a huge impact on their business, right? And so no matter how much projecting or all of that you can do, there's some things that happen that you can never ever plan for. And so in those budgets, you have to scrap it and kind of start from the beginning. Anyways, all right, so anyways, yes, you use prior year's budget information and you project from there, okay? So one of the budgets we're going to talk about is the static budget. Now, a static budget is a budget that shows the expected results of a responsibility center for only one level of activity. So in our particular example that you see in the screen is that you're seeing only one level of activity, production activity, which is for 10,000 units. Now, a static budget, in the word itself, static means that it doesn't change. We're going to create a budget only for one level of activity. Now, static budgets are utilized by service companies, governments, and some functions of a manufacturing company. So you have to imagine that a static budget is probably utilized for departments that don't change much, right? Because if it's only at one level of activity, you cannot expect it to be a dynamic, a static budget to be useful in a very dynamic manufacturing company, meaning things change often, right? So one of the disadvantages of a static budget is that it does not adjust for changes in activity levels. So what that means is what happens if you produce more than 10,000 units, right? So the one example I want to kind of go over, it's not in the slides, unfortunately, but hear me out for a second. When we're talking about a static budget, what happens if you spend, the manufacturing company spends you know, $70,800. So instead of spending $60,000, they spend $70,800. So initially you ask, hey, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is that good news or bad news? So if the budget was $60,000 and you spent $70,000, did you go over budget? So most likely, most people would say, yes, they went over budget. They didn't stay within budget. That's the first reaction. However, what if they actually produced a lot more units? So instead of producing maybe 10,000 units, maybe they produced an additional, I don't know, 2,000 units, right? So it's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's just that when you have a static budget, it does not allow for different levels of activity. It's only allowed for one activity, okay? So this is where a flexible budget comes into play. As in the word flexible, budget adjusts for different levels of activity. And what I would say is a flexible budget is just multiple static budgets at different levels, basically. So a flexible budget shows expected results for several activity levels. So it can be for maybe 10,000 units, 12,000 units, 14,000 units, so forth and so on. So what you see, sorry, my screen is a little messed up. So, sorry, all right. So yeah, here it is. So what you see here is the flexible budget at these different levels. So again, you have maybe, you know, 8,000, 9,000, 10,000 units, right? I'm not sure why this is sliding over here like this, but I'm gonna let it go. So it's a series of static budgets and at different levels. And then when you look at developing a flexible budget, step one is to identify relevant activity levels. Step two is to identify fixed and variable costs being budgeted. And step three is to prepare a budget for each activity level, okay? So with that, I wanna do a quick comparison of a static budget versus a flexible budget. With a flexible budget, actual costs can be compared to the budgeted cost for the actual activity. Now that may not sound like much to you, but in the very first portion of this slide, in this part, this is looking at a, you know, you're comparing a static budget to actual results. So no matter if they produce an additional 2,000 units, when you're comparing a static budget compared to actual results, all you're looking at is, hey, did they follow the budget? The budget was 60,000 and did they stick to it? No, therefore you are inefficient. You went over budget, right? It doesn't take into consideration that you produce more, you are more efficient, it doesn't, right? And so a flexible budget, you're comparing, again, under a flexible budget, you're comparing budgeted against your actual cost. And so in this particular case, for instance, we're looking at producing 10,000 units, right? And then we're looking at actual. So a flexible budget says, okay, I'm gonna act as if my budget was for 10,000 units. So now I'm gonna compare my flexible budget of 10,000 units at that level compared to what my actual results. And when we compared it to, my budget says that if I'm gonna produce 10,000 units, I should have spent $71,000. But when I compare it against my actual results, I spent $70,800. So in this particular example, when we're looking at flexible budget, it lends itself to looking at how the 10,000 in a flexible budget compares to the 10,000 units at actual. And if we're comparing it to, what we see is that we actually spent $200 under budget. Okay, so I know I was a little bit everywhere with that particular example, but hopefully that kind of made sense to you, being that a flexible budget, as it sounds, is a little more flexible than a static budget. Okay, so with that, we're going to take a pause and then we're going to go all into master budget.